We're back for week 2 of the DFS slate, and there's still $1 million rooskies to first place. Let's dive into this slate. And we'll start by identifying who is the Tua Tagovailoa play of the week, the quarterback that is a slight underdog in a great game environment, which is the best spot historically for quarterbacks in fantasy and DFS, and that is Trevor Lawrence. And oh boy, that's a pretty good quarterback in this game. He comes in, the Jacksonville Jaguars, as you can see right here, they have a 24-point team total. That's pretty damn solid. They're 3.5-point underdogs against the Kansas City Chiefs with a 51.5-point game total. This is basically a spitting image of last week, as the Dolphins were slight underdogs, 3-point underdogs with a 51.5-point total against the Chargers. You have his clear stacking options in this order: Calvin Ridley, Zay Jones, and even Christian Kirk in a potential bounce back game. Now, speaking of one of those options in Zay Jones, he's dirt cheap at just $4,700, even though he was an every down starter with Calvin Ridley over Christian Kirk last week, like we saw in the preseason. More specifically, as you can see on the Fantasy Life data, our official data partner, you can see 94% of the routes run for Zay Jones compared to Christian Kirk just 66%, and this led to a strong performance. Calvin Ridley stole all the headlines, but Zay Jones was really good. He actually saw more downfield usage than Ridley in similar key situational usage. He put up 16.5 points on 7 targets. So we now have a 20-game sample of Zay Jones being a top 25 receiver, but he's not priced like it, and he's low owned in the DFS blueprint. So now, as a run back option on the opposite side of this game, let's say Travis Kelce doesn't suit up. Well, who do you have? Well, look, this is going to sound disgusting after he didn't do anything to open the year, but Sky Moore is just $4,100. And this is the exact type of play that nobody wants to play, even though he's $4,100, as a receiver who went out there and ran the second most routes for the Kansas City Chiefs last week. It only led to 3 targets, but no one's going to own this guy, and if he just finds himself in a game where he has 6 or 7 targets, this is going to pay off. But of course, it is a pretty stinky situation, but hey, that's what makes a leverage play. Now to the running back position we go. One of the better values on the overall slate, depending on where he comes in ownership-wise, we'll see if it's going to be a solid play, is Rashad White at just $5,500. He saw elite usage week 1. Specifically, it was 79% of the snaps, 57% of the carries, and 55% of the routes. He saw 19 touches in that game, and people are saying, oh, he was inefficient, he stinks. Well, Sean Tucker was also inefficient. Leonard Fournette was inefficient last year. This offensive line is worse than it was last year due to preseason injuries. It's probably mostly the running scheme that is holding them down. But in this game, he's a 3-point favorite against the Bears, who got gashed by Aaron Jones last week, and in similar matchups, starting running backs average over 14 fantasy points. Now, the ultimate stud running back is Christian McCaffrey, who's probably not expensive enough at $8,900, because last week we saw the vintage CMC role. Even though they were in a blowout, the 49ers, against the Steelers, he was still seeing dominant usage. He commanded everything. He had the most running back snaps on the week at 85%. He saw 69% of the carries and 79% of the routes run. This led to a massive 26 opportunities, and yeah, he's going to be high owned, one of the top 5 owned guys on the week, but if there's anybody you're going to play at high ownership, it's him. Now, there is another stud running back who's low owned, and let's get into him. And if you're finding this helpful, make sure you hit the subscribe button. As we continue to grow this channel, it'll let you see my future videos for future weeks' content. And that running back that I'm surprised is coming in below 7% ownership as of right now is Tony Pollard, $7,500. Yeah, the matchup is tough against the Jets, but he's nearly a 10-point favorite. And last week, Pollard was fantastic. Even in a game that was 40-0, a blowout, he came off the field early in this one because he wasn't needed. He still puts up 16 touches on 17 opportunities, finds the end zone twice. And more specifically about the end zone, Pollard saw an elite red zone role. People thinking this is a smaller running back. He's over 210 pounds, people. He can see the red zone work. He led the entire NFL with 7 red zone rushes, but more importantly, when they were inside the 10-yard line, according to Fantasy Life's data, he saw 85% of the carries. Inside the 5-yard line on the goal line, he saw 100% of the rush attempts. Zeke is no longer here. This is an elite workload for Pollard. So Pollard's a lower owned running back as of right now. Now here's a lower owned wide receiver, and it's going to be the Bengals wide receiver T. Higgins after he had 8 targets. That's fantastic last week, but 0 catches. That's why nobody wants to play him. And look, it was a bad game. Bad weather. The starters came out in the 4th quarter. Joe Burrow was struggling, having to wear a glove after not practicing for 2 months. But the underlying usage is good. T. Higgins earned a target. His targets per route run, TPRR, on 21% of his routes. He had 24% of the Bengals targets, the target share. This is basically in line, if not better than, his career average numbers. And according to Pro Football Focus, T. Higgins has a top 10 matchup against the Baltimore secondary. Baltimore has a bunch of players, multiple players now banged up in the secondary. And I'm also a fan of his quarterback, who is coming in slightly low owned. And it's $6,900 Joe Burrow, who is in this similarly good matchup. And look, the overall environment is nice. Outside of a potentially lower owned stack, you have the Bengals with a 24.5-point team total in that good matchup against Baltimore. And the game total is nice too. Baltimore should put up points. They have 20 plus projected points, 23 points actually. So it's like a 47, 48 point overall total is strong. I'd actually prefer his stacking options to be number 1 T. Higgins, then Jamar Chase, and Irv Smith in that order. And the reason I like Irv Smith is, look, he's just $3,200. He's an easy punt tight end to get in your lineup, but he actually saw good usage last week. According to the Fantasy Life data, Irv Smith ran a route on 71% of the dropbacks. This is borderline elite numbers for a tight end, and this resulted in 5 targets, which is good usage for a cheap tight end. Now, another tight end who is appealing in a tough matchup at a higher price point coming in with no ownership is Tyler Higbee, because last week everybody liked him. I liked him last week too, and he laid an egg for everybody as Puka Nacua and Tutu Atwell, the young wide receivers, popped off, but now those guys are higher owned in a brutal matchup. And Higbee's usage was still solid last week. He ran 31 routes. He was out there for almost every single passing play. He only saw 3 targets, yes, but expect him to be involved in the red zone and a consistent chain mover this week. Now, on the opposite side of this game, on the 49ers side of the ball, of course, there's like the Brandon Ayuks of the world, but there's another receiver who's appealing. And this mostly has to do with the price point at just $5,600 of Deebo Samuel, even though the 49ers have a 26-point team total. Yes, it was Ayuk who stole the show last week, but Deebo still saw solid usage. He actually led these 49ers receivers running 34 routes, 4 more than Brandon Ayuk. And yeah, Brandon Ayuk had the 8 targets, but Deebo had 6 targets, still pretty solid, and 2 rush attempts for a team that didn't really have to throw the ball all that much in the third and fourth quarter. The 49ers have the 4th highest team total on the week. At this price tag, expect ownership to be drawn Deebo's way. But a wide receiver who's not drawing a lot of ownership right now is DeAndre Hopkins, and this might be because of where he's priced next to Keenan Allen, Calvin Ridley, even a Michael Pittman who had a nice week, a Jerry Jeudy who's returning this week, but I actually like Hopkins. And this is under the assumption that the ownership stays below 10% ownership like it is right now, because look at this. Last week, a nice performance, 13.5 points. In a game where his quarterback and offense struggled, he still got there, seeing 13 targets, had a 33% target rate. When he was running a route, 1 out of every 3 times he was targeted. And he had 136 air yards, top 10 in the NFL last week, showing he's reliable based on the targets and has upside downfield. Expect more upside for the Tennessee offense and Hopkins with some touchdown potential against the Chargers defense this week. Now, I've referenced ownership, some projections, the DFS blueprint throughout this. If you want to get that and join over 1,700 people, yes, this many people who are currently using it, you can check it out, link down below on my Patreon. And this is everything that you'll get in the blueprint. It's a lot. You can pause the screen, you can look at all of it, but it's every single day of the week, multiple things, whether it's the podcast on Sunday morning that's exclusive only to Patreons, talking about the best stacks, the best way to approach a slate, best leverage plays, my percentage owned of all the players, all of that stuff, whether it's the projections and ownership throughout the week, whether it's stuff for your season-long leagues, game-by-game matchup notes, the player props, do all of this, you can check it out, link down below. Or if it's easier for you, you can scan the QR code on the screen right now and literally join the thousands of people at this time that are currently using the blueprint. Back to the running back position we go, and I'm looking at Detroit, where I don't know how David Montgomery is only $5,800, even though he's a touchdown favorite with a 26.5-point team total, as by far the starting running back on this team. To open up the season on Thursday Night Football in week 1, he played 77% of the snaps, saw 21 touches, and ran 53% of the routes. Now, Jahmyr Gibbs is expected to see more usage moving forward, but this is pretty clear-cut David Montgomery's backfield on early downs and in the red zone. Now, RB's in similar situations as a touchdown favorite with over a 26-point team total, average over 16 fantasy points, play Montgomery. And also consider Travis Etienne at $6,900. He's obviously more expensive than Montgomery. He's actually coming in with relatively low ownership as it stands right now, because week 1, he had an elite role. He saw a lot of career highs week 1. He played 80% of the snaps. He saw 53% of the carries. 83% of the routes run was a career high. His 5 receptions was a career high. Everything looked absolutely deadly for his production. Now, this week, he's coming in under 10% owned in that lovely game environment, 52 total points as a slight underdog against the Chiefs. Running backs in similar situations average over 17 fantasy points. Now, on the opposite side of Travis Etienne in this game is the Patrick Mahomes side of the ball, where he's the most expensive quarterback, and this is really difficult to like if Travis Kelce does not suit up, because who are you going to stack him with? Now, I know we talked about Sky Moore, but that's more so for a run back in the Trevor Lawrence stacks. It's difficult to pay up for this Mahomes stack without Travis Kelce. You can see here, 54% completions. That's bad last week. Just 5.8 yards per attempt. The average in the NFL is like 7.2. That's really bad. I'd say that guys like Tony, Sky Moore, MVS, Noah Gray are stacking pieces, but none of them have the upside without Travis Kelce. Now, a player who might have a lot of upside if indeed his starting running back is out is Joshua Kelly at 5,000. Becomes the slam dunk chalk play of the week that you got to play no matter what if Eckler misses time. Because in week 1, Josh Kelly actually split the running back carries, 16 each with Eckler. He had a touchdown, over 90 rushing yards. He played 45% of the snaps, was being used on third down and longs, was being used in the 2-minute offense as well. He saw a great role. At 215 pounds and he's a capable pass catcher, he has some cheat code upside. And the Chargers led the entire NFL in neutral run rate when the game was close, and just in general last week, where they were running the ball the most under new offensive coordinator Kellen Moore. Now we go back to the wide receivers, and I think Michael Pittman at 6,300 is an absolute fantastic play, and let's reference one of my tweets about this. Michael Pittman was 15th in wide receiver usage last week, so the Colts surprisingly threw at the 7th highest rate when the game was close. We thought they were going to be a run-first team. No, under Shane Steichen, similar to what he did with Jalen Hurts and the Eagles when he was their coach last year and in past years, a mobile quarterback, but they threw the ball a lot. This led to 11 targets for Pittman. He was by far the wide receiver one. And the most fun part, as my tweet leaves off, was that 89% of his targets were catchable. That would rank top 10 amongst wide receivers last year. Even though Richardson was an inaccurate quarterback in college, that wasn't the case week one. A lot of credit to the coach, Shane Steichen. Now let's take a look at the fantasy blueprint as I just filter this by Michael Pittman. Projected for 13.5 points. That's very good. That's a median projection. His ceiling is in the 20s. And look at this. Right now, he's only 4.7% owned. This is a legit wide receiver one and an offense that looked solid week one with a rookie quarterback. A lot of people are sleeping on this at below 5% owned. Again, if you want to get access to all of the players, that's just like 5% of what you get for the entire week is that blueprint with all those tools. Again, QR code on the screen or click the link down below. We'll stick with the wide receivers in a similar range. I do prefer Michael Pittman, but another guy who's coming in below 5% owned is Tyler Lockett, despite a solid week one. We can track his injury status this week, but look at this right here. Lockett ran a route on 90% of the dropbacks. Jackson Smith, the Jigba, the rookie, he earned a lot of targets, 5, but he only ran 66% of the routes because he's only a slot-only player right now. Because of this, Lockett is not picking up any ownership. None of these guys really are after a bad week one for the Seahawks offense. But as a slight underdog in a really nice game environment for the Seahawks this week, I think they're going to pass the ball 35 plus times against Detroit. It's a good spot at low ownership. This $6,000 range is just filled with awesome options. We just talked about a couple of them. We talked about Hopkins earlier, and Jerry Jeudy returns this week at 6,600. And boy, oh boy, do the Broncos need him after last week having to rely on Brandon Johnson and little Jordan Humphrey to run 42 routes and combined for 5 targets and 40 yards. This offense in Denver only had 6 total drives week one, so they're playing pretty slow. Hopefully Jeudy can speed things up. He averaged over 18 points his final 6 games last year. Now, a value wide receiver option, we talked about Zay Jones earlier. He's the best in this 4K range, but he might pick up some ownership. Still the best, but Treylon Burks at $4,500 has a lot of upside if this offense and Ryan Tannehill can bounce back. They threw at a top 10 rate when the game was close last week, pretty surprisingly. And yeah, Burks didn't have a great game, just 2 catches for 18 yards, but his usage was strong. And a reminder, Burks last week was coming off of an LCL injury. He returned in 3 weeks for something that takes usually 4 to 6 weeks and still saw career high usage running 93% of the routes. He's a young, exciting player at low ownership and a low price tag. Now, a couple of players that we talked about were David Montgomery and Patrick Mahomes, and I actually have some action on them this week on Vivid Picks. You can see my slip coming up on the screen. I took the over on David Montgomery's rushing yards. I have him almost 20 yards over this number. And Patrick Mahomes, even if Kelsey plays, have him under his passing yard number. I have him in like the 270s. This one is way too high. If you want to take any of these, click the link in the description below. You'll get a free match up to $100 or scan the QR code on the screen. Now, similar to Treylon Burks, another young and exciting player who has a lot of upside is Luke Musgrave because his week one was great. He ran 80% of the Packers routes, and tight ends who see this type of usage typically finish on average for that week as a top 12 tight end, and this is what happened with Musgrave. He had the second most receiving yards as a rookie making his debut amongst tight ends with 50 last week, catching 3 of his 4 targets, and he was overthrown on that other target, would have been a walk-in touchdown, and one of his receptions on a fumbled snap, that was a lovely pass from Jordan Love off his back foot in a hurry, a broken play, if you will. Musgrave should have had a touchdown, but he stumbled after that. This guy looks legit. He's out there for almost every play. Play him. And then consider this next tight end who might be like 2% owned. And this is purely a leverage play because there's so many lower price, like a Musgrave, like an Irv Smith tight ends this week, but Kyle Pitts at 4,200 on the opposite side of this game is appealing. And now he's mostly appealing because he'll be a leverage play, but look at this tweet that I had. The data is from Fantasy Life, and it's, look, 91% of the routes run is what Kyle Pitts was running last week. This is like 20-30% higher than we were seeing from last season. So if Atlanta, as underdogs, are forced to throw more against Green Bay, you can see him running a route on 35% of dropbacks instead of just 20 from last week. So now we'll move from the tight end position back to the quarterback. And we'll talk about Josh Allen at $7,900. Look, week one was a brutal spot for him in this offense, but they faced the number 3 overall defense in the Jets from that week. Heading into week 2, it's a totally different story in terms of the matchup, and you can see this based on their overall Vegas total. They have the highest team total on the week at 28.5 points in most spots. In similar matchups, Josh Allen averages nearly 26 points on 300 plus total yards. I also like Josh Allen's running back this week in James Cook. He's $6,100, and he looked like the legit RB1 in week 1. Cook saw all the usage, 61% of the snaps, 67% of the carries, 50% of the routes. He saw 18 opportunities. The other running backs here, and Damian Harris and Latavius Murray, only 7 total opportunities. Now in week 1, he had that tough matchup against the Jets, but this week he's a 9-point favorite against the Raiders. Starting running backs in similar matchups average over 14 fantasy points. We'll stick in this price range, and then there's James Conner, who, look, he's just not overall an appealing offense at all, but he does have a nice matchup against the Giants, who got destroyed by Tony Pollard and the Cowboys last week, and James Conner had quietly an elite role in week 1. Nobody else was seeing usage as Conner played 83% of the snaps. Only Christian McCaffrey had more running back snaps week 1. He saw 58% of the rush attempts, 76% of the route runs. That number is really important because running backs who average 70% or higher of the routes run average a top 12 fantasy finish. Conner was PFF's #1 graded running back week 1 and now is a beneficial matchup. And now if you're looking for a punt wide receiver play, his teammate is somebody to at least look at. $3,300 Michael Wilson. I don't think this is the best play on the slate, but if you're looking for somebody down here, he at least has a full-time role. More specifically, that role was running a team-high 91% of the routes tied with Hollywood Brown. He ended up seeing a couple of targets in this game. Now, the production wasn't great, just 2 catches for like 19 yards, but the usage was. He saw an average target distance of 17 yards downfield, meaning he was seeing the deep targets. And as a 216-pound wide receiver, he has 30 more pounds on any of the other starting receivers for the Cardinals, so he should have some red zone upside. Now, one more wide receiver that I got to mention is Chris Godwin, because his price tag keeps dropping. He's just $6,000 flat in a nice matchup against a struggling Bears secondary and overall defense. It was Mike Evans who got all of the attention week 1 because of the touchdown, but there was still a solid role for Godwin. As you can see from the Fantasy Life data, Godwin ran just 1 less route than Mike Evans, and yeah, Evans had 9 targets, but Godwin had 6 targets. And if we know anything from the past couple of years, there will be big Mike Evans weeks, and then there will be big Chris Godwin weeks. Now, we were talking about Travis Kelce earlier. If he does not happen to suit up, you could look at $3,400 Noah Gray, because he is attached to Kansas City's quarterback, Patrick Mahomes, and yeah, last week he looked decent. This was a productive player from college, and Noah Gray ran 82% of the routes. That's an elite number for the tight end position. This led to 5 targets. 2 of those targets weren't catchable from Mahomes, so expect that to improve because we know Mahomes is a pretty accurate QB. So Gray is a solid punt option if there's no Kelce. He might pick up a little bit more ownership, though, compared to the Irv Smiths and Luke Musgraves of the world. So these are the best plays for week 2 of the DFS DraftKings slate with $1 million to first place. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit the subscribe button. And if you want to access all the exclusive tools, analysis, and content that are available for over the thousands of people on our Patreon right now, click the link in the description below or scan the QR code on the screen.